And however, when the brain gets tired in general, the left brain really falls off in performance. At that same time, the right brain is still clunking along at about a 50% rate, which it's had from the beginning. It's not real good at identifying targets, but it keeps going. It just keeps going. It's like they called it a skeleton vigilance that just keeps rolling on after the rest of the brain is kind of going. Did you ever have the experience of driving, usually on a big freeway, and you're coming to a town, and suddenly you find yourself the other side of the town? You didn't even know that you went by the town? I've had that a lot, and you say, my God, I drove right by Toledo, and, which could be a real advantage, but you know. But it seems as though the right brain is the thing that's doing the driving at that point when the left brain goes to sleep. When I was a student, I used to go between University of Detroit and Cleveland, NASA, where I worked I had my co-op engineering job there. I was always tired after final exams. You jump in the car and you have to drive because you had to be at work the next day. And you drive 180 miles on the freeway, usually in bad weather and everything else up there. And I'd have the radio on, and I learned that when I stopped hearing the radio, I was asleep. And so that's the way it was. I'd be driving along, all of a sudden I wouldn't hear the radio anymore. I knew I was asleep. And then I'd do something, I'd blink my lights on and off, and it'd wake myself, a jolt of adrenaline would wake myself up. That's why it was real interesting for me to read about Steve Labarge's work and the fact that you can be in dreams and think you're awake, you know, but you have to have some cues to tell you that you're not really in the dream or that you are in the dream. Okay, now there's another area in which you can bypass the left hemisphere, and that's by going low on cortical arousal to the point where the left doesn't work anymore because it's too low in arousal. This is certain types of hypnosis with relaxation procedures, twilight learning, reverie, which is what the Menninger people call it, when they take you to a theta state through EEG biofeedback, sleep learning, sensory isolation, and we might now include some light sound patterns that would tend to take you to the theta point as well. Then you're escaping the left brain vigilance or critical screening. Is that a good idea? Well, it is and it isn't. Seemed like a great idea back then. Now we have some reservations. I mean, it's still a pretty good idea, but there's some qualifications now that we'll talk about. In any case, the primitives used these techniques, and we're just beginning to rediscover them. But we don't trust primitive techniques, so we have to do it through technology. We don't have the time to study to be shamans. You know, it takes too many years, and it seems too slow, and to sit with a teacher by a fire for hours and hours and years, you know, that just seems too long for us. And so we got to move a little bit faster along and got to try to get, if we can, and I don't know if we're going to be able to do that or not. I doubt that we'll ever get to where the shamans get to with years and years of training, but we may be able to approximate some of that through technology. Now, there's some strange conditions under which, even with the left brain intact, you can bypass the critical screening faculties. Those are hypnosis of a certain type, like Erickson's embedded suggestions. Those of you familiar with Ericksonian hypnosis know what that's all about, and this is this is one of the most informative crowds or audiences I've ever spoken to, and I'm really impressed. And so I think probably everybody's heard of Erickson, or almost everybody, but one of the world's great hypnotists who used very interesting techniques. He didn't have to take people very deep asleep at all. He could do that, but he didn't need to. He could embed suggestions in a totally conscious state that would escape the critical screening faculties of the left hemisphere. Highly authoritarian commands. If you were at a cocktail party and you know that there was a man there or a woman who won the Nobel Prize in math, and you happen to be talking to that person said, you know, 2 + 2 is not 4. You'd probably say, you're right. I'll bet you're right. Yes, I believe it, you know, because after all, you got the Nobel Prize in math. Well, that's highly authoritarian commands have a way of blasting right through your consciousness and doing that sort of thing. The Army counts on that a lot when part of their training. Random numbers procedure is something that we evolved many years ago. A very intriguing procedure which most people don't like to do, however. And what it is that you feed random numbers very fast-paced into a tape recorder play them back and recite them as you hear them. It's better if you put them in the right ear, and then in your left ear you put the change message. Now, as long as you keep following the numbers real closely, you're repeating them out loud as the tape recorder is playing them. As long as you're repeating them, your left brain is so busy with that task that it can't defend against what's going into the left ear, and therefore to your right brain, because they cross over. And that's a technique that tends to work, but people don't like to use it because it drives them crazy. The left brain does not like to be out of the picture, and it does not like to be removed from the absorption of that information coming in. So it's never become very popular as a technique. But now we have tapes that have multiple voices, and that's a little more pleasant to try to process. And we'll talk about some of those later. The real high-tech tapes that are being made these days that have binaural tones, we call ours hypersync tones, that entrain brain waves, and we'll show you some of that as well. And they have multiple voices, and then they sometimes have other things. They might be subliminal or not subliminal, but in our new tapes we use triple track voices, one in the center and two whisper tracks, which we learned about from Alexis Fight in France, who spoke earlier. Some of the new European ideas are quite exciting with regard to audio cassettes. So anyway, all of these procedures seem to have this effect of being able to bypass certain of the critical screening faculties in general. They were used since ancient times and are being rediscovered today. Okay, let's go down the line here. This is a very interesting book called Hypnagogia, which if you haven't seen it, you might be interested in getting it. It's the definitive work in this area, the best I've ever seen. And if there's anything you've ever wanted to know about Twilight states, this has got it in there. It's by Mavromatis. I can't remember his first name. Hypnagogia. Wonderful book on this. The twilight state is really that in-between state between wakefulness and sleep, and everybody here knows that, but I thought I would give you a visual to take into your right brain. Makes it easier than later on. And it's fascinated people from the time. Freud is very fascinated with this. He was very concerned about the fact that in what he called a fugue state, which is sort of a twilight state, it's a state in which your left brain faculties are not operating. It can happen when you're in automobile accidents and you're stunned afterwards and you're not thinking properly. Many of you have probably had that happen. You get a whiplash injury and you have that kind of little concussion that takes place. By the way, we are now finding out that that often causes damage. You get some axons that are stripped and split and cut and severed and so on, sometimes at the stalk where the stalk connects with the main part of the brain when you have a whiplash injury. And that's why you have so much trouble, maybe for a year, year and a half, with concentration and hyper-irritability, mood swings, I've said that already, I've had that kind of an injury, problem concentrating, and so on. In any case, the twilight state has been studied by artistic people particularly, and Elmer Green, back in the early days of biofeedback at Menninger Foundation, brought 3 demonstrably creative people into his lab. These are folks that had all kinds of publications of poems or were many publications in research journals and so on. Each of the 3 said that they got to a special state in order to do their creative thing. And so he hooked them up to the EEG, and he wanted to see what was the pattern they showed getting into that special state, if indeed they could in the lab. And as a matter of fact, they could. Well, at least 2 of the 3 did. And here's what they found. The 2 that got all the way to that special state got into theta, and we're showing predominantly theta EEG. The other fellow that said, I didn't quite make it, but I was on my way, slowed alpha by about 1 hertz. So he went from about 10 down to 9. So slowing alpha is a very special state in and of itself. And later on, we'll show you some of the effects of sound light on the brain with some topographs that are quite intriguing. So what's so special about the twilight state? Well, it is that the brain is still active enough to accept information, but doesn't bring to bear on that information its normal, full, defensive capability. That has, as I say, it's a blessing and a curse. Because when you go into a twilight state, you can do two things. You can put stuff in or take stuff out. And sometimes you can't control very easily what the brain does with what goes in, and sometimes you can't control with what comes out, and you can't handle it. So we'll get into that a little bit too. We're going to get into a lot of things if we ever have time to do it. What about creativity? Is there something special in terms of creativity? Well, Elmer Green's work certainly showed that there might be. And you're all familiar with the fact that a number of, there have been a number of books about creativity, and they've all showed that demonstrably creative people, they like to get into kind of a drowsy state in order to get their ideas. Kekulé, or however you pronounce his name, the great organic chemist, developed some of his best ideas by gazing into a fireplace, and the flickering flames would take him probably into a theta state. And then he would start to see hallucinatory images, hypnagogic images they're called. And these are images that come from deep within the brain, and they're not usually connected with any kind of logic process. And as a result, they're very, very creative because they're not tied to the usual constraints of logic. And so smart folks that have learned to be creative, like Edison, used to have his favorite procedure. He'd stand up against the wall because he could fall asleep very easily, hold a steel ball in his hand out at right angles like this. He'd have a pot cover right underneath, and as soon as he fell asleep, the ball would fall, hit the pot cover, and he would pop out of his theta state and write down whatever ideas he had in his mind at that time. So it's useful for that. Now, this is a diagram of what a twilight learning session looks like. And let me explain a little bit about getting back now to why we got into twilight learning. If we could get rid of that little voice that kept saying, like hell you are, every time you tried a conscious affirmation. I don't know how many of you people have used affirmations. Probably most of you at one time or another. You know, some people, they work really well, and others, they bounce off every time. Why is that? And she taught affirmation classes, and everything she did, and she did lots of things, went very, very well. Affirmations really worked for her, and they worked almost every time. And she brought herself from some very difficult situations when the husband left her with the kids and no money to a very nice, profitable position and a PhD and everything else. So she really did well with affirmations. And I said to her one day, do the people in your classes, now be honest, do they have those affirmations work for them like they do for you? I mean, is it as successful for them, really? And she said, well, not really. No, I wouldn't say that. If I had to be honest, and she was, and she said, they really, for some reason they work for me, but they don't work for most people as well. You can get a lot done, particularly if they're persistent. I said, what was your background like, your childhood when you grew up? She said, well, I was raised on a ranch, and I had 4 older brothers and a real nice Marlboro-type dad that was very kind and same time a real man, you know, when he rode horses and bucked cattle or whatever, you know, all these things. And the mother was stay in the kitchen and cook apple pies and be real sweet, and you could always run to her if you had a problem, and she was very nurturing, and everybody loved everybody else, and my brothers took care of me. I said, did anything bad ever happen to you? Did anybody ever beat you or yell at you or anything? She said, no, I can't think of anything like that. She said, I had a lot of friends, and I said, and they were all pretty good people. Yeah, we were, you know, that was fun going to school. I enjoyed school, and I once broke my arm. That was the only bad thing that happened. She broke an arm one time. I said, well, what happened? Well, my dad picked me up very gingerly, and my brothers all gathered around, you know, and one of them kind of held my arm. We walked in the house, and Mom called the doctors, and they said, bring her over to the hospital. So we got in the car and drove over there, and she said, no big deal. She said it healed nicely, and all of our neighbors came over with chicken soup and things. And I said, nothing bad ever happened to you, did it? You know, I was very frustrated, you know, myself. I said, sure, nothing bad?